Welcome, traveler of time, to tonight's gentle descent into the quiet corners of history. Whether you're resting after a long day or simply seeking a moment of calm, I'm grateful to have you here. Do let me know where you're listening from and what hour it is for you. I imagine us as glowing dots on a spinning globe, connected by curiosity and the hush of night. And if this peaceful storytelling brings a little stillness to your day, feel free to subscribe. We'll have many more historical tales to share. Now, I know what you think of museums for their thinking. Another right, wrong. What Egyptian queen? Another mystery I'm about to reveal to you goes way beyond your typical historical disappearance. We're talking about a woman who potentially challenged Egyptian politics, rewrote the rules of ancient power, and might have even ruled Egypt as pharaoh under a completely different identity. In this series, I'm going to take you on a journey through the sand-swept corridors of Amarna, the forgotten capital that Nefertiti called home. We'll explore the scandalous rumors that surrounded her relationship with Akhenaten, uncover the shocking evidence that suggests she wielded more power than any queen before her, and investigate the three most compelling theories about what really happened to Egypt's most mysterious ruler. By the end of this series, you'll understand why Nefertiti wasn't just another pretty face on a throne. She was a political mastermind, a religious revolutionary, and quite possibly the most dangerous woman in ancient Egypt. And that danger might be exactly why she had to disappear. But first, let me paint you a picture of the world Nefertiti was born into. Because without understanding the chaos of 14th century BCE Egypt, you'll never truly grasp the magnitude of what this woman accomplished. Picture the undisputed superpower of the ancient world. The pharaohs controlled territory stretching from Nubia in the south all the way to the Euphrates River in modern-day Iraq. Gold flows like water from Nubian mines. Tribute pours in from vassal states, and the temples of Amun-Ra in Thebes have become so wealthy they rival the power of the pharaoh himself. Into this world of unimaginable wealth and rigid tradition steps a young prince named Amenhotep, later known as Akhenaten. And somewhere in the royal courts, either as a princess from a foreign land or a daughter of Egyptian nobility, a girl named Nefertiti is preparing for a destiny that would shake the very foundations of Egyptian civilization. Where most historians get Nefertiti wrong is they paint her as the beautiful wife who simply followed her husband's radical religious reforms. But the evidence tells a completely different story. From the moment she appears in the historical record, Nefertiti is portrayed not as a subservient queen, but as an equal partner in power. And for ancient Egypt, that's not just unusual, that's virtually unheard of. Let me tell you about the first time we really see Nefertiti in action, because it's a scene that would make any modern power couple jealous. Picture the forecourt of Karnak Temple, where for over 1,000 years the same sacred rituals have been conducted. The air is thick with incense, and the gleam of gold was everywhere. Thousands of worshippers prostrate themselves before the hidden one whose name means the concealed one. But Akhenaten and Nefertiti come not to worship. They're there to revolutionize. Instead of honoring Amun-Ra, they begin construction of temples to a completely different deity, the disk of the sun, the Aten. Here's the kicker that most people miss. In the reliefs and inscriptions from these early temples, Nefertiti isn't standing dutifully behind her husband. She's right there beside him, making offerings to the Aten, wielding the sacred scepter and performing rituals that traditionally only pharaohs were allowed to perform. The priests of Amun-Ra must have been absolutely livid. For over a millennium, they had been the kingmakers who legitimized pharaonic rule through their divine connection to the hidden god. And now this young couple was essentially telling them that their god was obsolete, that the only deity worth worshipping was one that anyone could simply by looking up at the sky. But Nefertiti and Akhenaten were just getting started. Around year 5 of Akhenaten's reign, they made a decision that sent shockwaves throughout the ancient world. They abandoned Thebes entirely and built a new capital city, completely in the middle of nowhere. A place they called Akhenaten, which means horizon of the Aten. Today we know it as Amarna. Now, founding a new capital might not sound like a big deal to us, but in the ancient world, this was essentially declaring war on the established order. Thebes wasn't just a city. It was the beating heart of Egyptian civilization, the place where pharaohs were crowned and where the gods themselves were believed to reside. By abandoning it, Akhenaten and Nefertiti were saying that they didn't need the old gods, the old priests, or the old ways of doing things. And Nefertiti's role in this revolutionary city reveals just how unprecedented her power really was. Archaeological evidence from Amarna shows us something that would have been unthinkable in traditional Egyptian society. There are temples where Nefertiti alone makes offerings to the Aten without Akhenaten present. There are scenes where she's depicted smiting Egypt's enemies, a role that was exclusively reserved for pharaohs. Most shocking of all, there are inscriptions that refer to her using pharaonic titles and epithets. Let me share with you one specific scene that perfectly captures just how radical Nefertiti's position really was. It's carved on the walls of a rock tomb in Amarna, and it shows the royal family in their private quarters. But this isn't your typical formal Egyptian art. Instead of the stiff, ritualized poses we're used to seeing, the Aten's rays stream down from above, while Akhenaten and Nefertiti play with their daughters in what appears to be a moment of genuine domestic bliss. But look closer and you'll notice something extraordinary. Nefertiti isn't portrayed as the smaller, subservient figure that Egyptian queens typically were in royal art. She's the same size as Akhenaten, positioned as his equal. And in some scenes, she's actually depicted as larger and more prominent than the pharaoh himself. This isn't just artistic license. This is a visual declaration that Nefertiti wielded power that was equal to or perhaps even greater than that of the pharaoh. The more we examine the evidence from Amarna, the clearer it becomes that Nefertiti wasn't just a queen. She was a co-ruler in the truest sense of the word. And this unprecedented power arrangement would have made her enemies throughout the Egyptian establishment. The displaced priests of Amun, Rare, the traditional nobility who had been sidelined, the military commanders who watched Egypt's empire begin to crumble, while the royal couple focused on religious revolution instead of foreign policy. All of these powerful groups had one thing in common. They wanted the old order restored, and Nefertiti stood directly in their way. But here's where the story takes an even more intriguing turn. Around year 12 of Akhenaten's reign, something happens that changes everything. The royal couple who had been portrayed as inseparable partners in their religious and political revolution suddenly begin to appear separately in official art and inscriptions. Nefertiti starts showing up alone in contexts where she had previously been depicted with Akhenaten. At first, historians assumed this meant the couple had some kind of falling out, perhaps a disagreement about the direction of their religious reforms. But recent archaeological discoveries have revealed a far more fascinating possibility. What if Nefertiti didn't fall from grace? What if she was actually being elevated to an even higher position? At the same time, a mysterious new figure begins appearing in the historical record. Someone called Nefertiti who bears all the titles and regalia of a pharaoh. For decades, Egyptologists couldn't figure out who this person was. Some thought it might be one of Akhenaten's sons. Others suggested it could be a previously unknown co-ruler. But then in a discovery that sent shockwaves through the archaeological community, researchers found evidence that Nefertiti and Nefertiti might be the same person. The hieroglyphic inscriptions, the artistic depictions, even the physical artifacts all point to an incredible possibility. Nefertiti didn't disappear from power. She was transformed by it. Think about the implications of this for a moment. If Nefertiti really did become pharaoh in her own right, she wouldn't just be unique in Egyptian history, she would be absolutely unprecedented. Yes, there had been female pharaohs before like Hatshepsut, but they typically ruled as regents for young male heirs, or in times of extreme crisis. Nefertiti would have claimed the throne at the height of her power, a continuation of the religious and political revolution that she had helped to orchestrate. But becoming pharaoh would have made her even more dangerous to Egypt's traditional power structures. A foreign queen who challenged the old gods was one thing, but a female pharaoh who threatened to permanently reshape Egyptian civilization. That was something that the established order simply could not tolerate. And that brings us to the central mystery that will drive the rest of our investigation. If Nefertiti really did become pharaoh, if she really did wield unprecedented power in ancient Egypt, then what happened to her? Why does she vanish from the historical record so completely? And most importantly, was her disappearance voluntary, or was it something far more sinister? The answers to these questions lie buried not just in the sands of Egypt, but in the tangled web of ancient politics, religious warfare, and palace intrigue that defined the final years of the Amarna period. And to understand what really happened to Nefertiti, we need to dive deep into the world of her enemies, because, trust me, she had plenty of them. Let's start with the man who had the most to lose from Nefertiti's rise to power. Horemheb, the general who would eventually become pharaoh himself. Picture this guy as the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a military strongman, a career soldier, who had spent decades building his power base while watching the empire his predecessors had built slowly crumble under Akhenaten's neglect of foreign affairs. Horemheb wasn't just any general. He was the kind of man who understood that power comes from the barrel of a spear, not from prayers to some sun disk that most Egyptians had never heard of before Akhenaten's revolution. While Nefertiti and her husband were busy building temples and writing hymns to the Aten, Egypt's vassal states in Syria and Palestine were falling like dominoes to rival powers. The gold that had flowed from Nubia was being threatened by rebellions, and Egypt's reputation as the ancient world's superpower was hanging by a thread. For Horemheb, Nefertiti represented everything that was wrong with the new order. Here was a foreign woman, possibly not even of royal blood, who had somehow maneuvered herself into a position where she was making decisions about Egypt's future. From his perspective, she wasn't just a threat to traditional religion. She was a threat to Egypt's very survival as a great power. But Horemheb was smart enough to know that he couldn't move against Nefertiti directly. Not while Akhenaten was still alive and the couple maintained their united front. So he waited, building alliances, consolidating power, and preparing for the moment when the Amarna experiment would inevitably collapse under its own contradictions. Then there was Nefertiti's own father. And here's where the story gets really twisted. I was what we might call the ultimate political survivor, a man who had navigated the treacherous waters of Egyptian court politics for decades. He had risen from relatively humble origins to become one of the most powerful men in Egypt, largely by positioning his daughter as the perfect bride for the future pharaoh. But here's the thing about political survivors like their loyalty is always conditional. As long as Nefertiti's power served his interests, he was her greatest supporter. But the moment that power became a liability, the moment it threatened his own survival, I would have no qualms about sacrificing even his own daughter to preserve his position. And by year 14 of Akhenaten's reign, there were plenty of signs that the Amarna experiment was becoming a liability The traditional priesthood was growing increasingly restless. The military was losing faith in the royal family's ability to defend Egypt's interests, and the common people were beginning to question whether the royal couple really cared about their daily struggles for survival. In the midst of this growing crisis, something extraordinary happens that gives us our first real clue about Nefertiti's fate. Archaeological evidence from this period shows us that someone began a systematic campaign to restore the old gods alongside the Aten. Temples to Amun, Ra were quietly reopened. Traditional festivals were allowed to resume, and diplomatic relations with Egypt's neighbors began to improve. This wasn't Akhenaten's doing. The man who had spent his entire reign trying to erase the old gods from Egyptian memory wouldn't suddenly reverse course and start compromising with his enemies. No, this careful political maneuvering bears all the hallmarks of someone far more pragmatic, someone who understood that pure ideological revolution was a luxury that Egypt could no longer afford. This bears all the hallmarks of Nefertiti's handiwork. Think about it from her perspective. She had achieved something no woman in Egyptian history had ever accomplished. She had claimed the throne as pharaoh in her own right. But what good is a throne if the kingdom you're ruling is falling apart around you? What good is unprecedented power if wielding it means watching Egypt collapse into chaos? So Nefertiti began what might be the most brilliant political pivot in ancient history. She started quietly undoing the most extreme aspects of Akhenaten's religious revolution while maintaining the appearance of loyalty to the Aten. She reached out to the displaced priesthood, offering them a path back to relevance. She began rebuilding Egypt's military and diplomatic relationships, restoring the empire's strength while carefully preserving her own position. But this balancing act was incredibly dangerous, and it made Nefertiti even more enemies than she already had. The hardcore supporters of Akhenaten's revolution saw her as a traitor who was selling out their cause for political convenience. The traditional establishment didn't trust her motives, viewing her concessions as nothing more than tactical retreats in a larger campaign to preserve her illegitimate power. And then there were her own family members, people like A, who were beginning to calculate whether their interests would be better served by supporting Nefertiti or by finding a way to replace her with someone more pliable, someone who could be controlled. The pressure was building from all sides, and something had to give. That something was Akhenaten himself. Around year 17 of his reign, the pharaoh who had turned Egyptian civilization upside down simply vanishes from the historical record. No death announcements, no funeral inscriptions, no tomb that archaeologists have been able to definitively identify. Had Akhenaten died of natural causes? Had he been assassinated? Or had Nefertiti herself decided that her husband had become more of a liability than an asset to her plans for Egypt's future? The evidence is frustratingly ambiguous. But one thing is clear. With Akhenaten gone, Nefertiti found herself in an even more precarious position than before. She was now a female pharaoh ruling alone without the legitimacy that had come from her partnership with a male ruler of undisputed royal blood. She was trying to navigate between the conflicting demands of religious conservatives who wanted a complete return to the old ways and revolutionaries who viewed any compromise as betrayal. And she was doing all of this while Egypt's enemies abroad sensed weakness and began testing the empire's defenses. It's at this crucial moment that we get our most intriguing piece of evidence about what happened next. Hidden away in a minor tomb at Amarna, archaeologists discovered a cache of documents that paint a picture of palace intrigue worthy of a modern political thriller. These papyri, written in the hurried script of government clerks, record a series of secret meetings between Nefertiti and various power brokers in the Egyptian establishment. The documents are fragmentary and often cryptic, written in the kind of coded language that ancient conspirators used to avoid leaving incriminating evidence. But they paint a picture of a woman who was desperately trying to secure her position while the ground shifted beneath her feet. In one papyrus, we see Nefertiti apparently negotiating with representatives of the Amun, Ra priesthood, offering to restore their temples and return their confiscated wealth in exchange for their recognition of her legitimacy as pharaoh. In another, she's corresponding with military commanders, promising them resources for campaigns to restore Egypt's crumbling empire. But the most fascinating document is a letter that appears to be from Nefertiti herself, written in her own hand to someone identified only as the one who knows the ancient ways. In this letter, she writes about her fears that the enemies of Ma'at gather like jackals around a wounded lion, and her determination to preserve the two lands, even if the cost is higher than the heart can bear. What did she mean by that cryptic final phrase? What cost was Nefertiti prepared to pay to preserve Egypt? And who was this mysterious correspondent who knew the ancient ways? The answers to these questions would determine not just Nefertiti's fate, but the future of Egyptian civilization itself. Because as year 18 of what had once been Akhenaten's reign dawned, the beautiful queen who had come to rule Egypt was about to face the ultimate test of her political skills. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the ancient world, and at its center stood a woman whose name meant, "The beautiful one has come," preparing to discover whether beauty, intelligence, and unprecedented power would be enough to survive the deadliest game in human history, the struggle for absolute power in ancient Egypt. But before that final confrontation could play out, Nefertiti would make one last desperate gambit. A move so audacious that it would either secure her place as Egypt's greatest ruler or ensure her complete erasure from history. And that gambit would involve the one person Nefertiti had never been able to fully trust. Her stepson Tutankhamun, the boy who would inherit everything she had fought to build. Picture this scene, if you will. It's early morning in the royal palace at Amarna, and the sun's first rays are streaming through the massive windows that Akhenaten had designed to let in as much of the Aten's light as possible. But instead of the harmonious family gatherings that had once characterized the royal household, we now see a much more tense dynamic playing out. Nefertiti sits across from a teenager who barely reaches her shoulder, but whose bloodline carries the one thing her political maneuvering cannot manufacture: unquestionable legitimacy as a descendant of the ancient pharaonic dynasties. Tutankhamun, probably no more than 9 or 10 years old at this point, fidgets under the intense gaze of the woman who has essentially been his stepmother, his co-ruler, and now potentially his greatest threat. What we know from the archaeological record suggests that this meeting wasn't just a family chat. Nefertiti was proposing something that would have been absolutely unprecedented in Egyptian history: a formal partnership between herself and the boy king, with her maintaining actual power, while he provided the legitimacy that came with his royal bloodline. Think about how desperate this move really was. Here's a woman who had spent nearly 2 decades accumulating power, who had successfully navigated. Think about how desperate this move really was. Here's a woman who had spent nearly 2 decades accumulating power, who had successfully navigated the treacherous waters of religious revolution, who had potentially murdered or exiled her own husband to secure her position. And now she's essentially asking a child to validate her rule. But Tutankhamun wasn't just any child. Despite his youth, he had grown up watching the political games that swirled around the throne. He had seen how Nefertiti had gradually accumulated power, how she had maneuvered herself from queen to co-ruler to pharaoh, and he had advisors, powerful men like A and Horemheb, who were whispering in his ear about what his future should really look like. The boy's response to Nefertiti's proposal reveals just how sophisticated the political calculations had become, even among Egypt's youngest players. According to fragmentary inscriptions found in the Valley of the Kings, Tutankhamun essentially told his stepmother that he would agree to her terms, but only if she agreed to begin the process of returning Egypt to its traditional religious practices. This wasn't just a religious demand, it was political genius wrapped in the language of piety. Tutankhamun was essentially forcing Nefertiti to choose between her ideological convictions and her practical need for legitimacy. If she agreed, she would be betraying everything she and Akhenaten had fought for. If she refused, she would be giving the boy king and his advisors the perfect excuse to move against her. Nefertiti's response to this ultimatum shows us exactly why she had survived so long in the deadly world of Egyptian palace politics. She didn't refuse outright, and she didn't agree immediately. Instead, she bought herself time by proposing a gradual transition, a careful reintegration of the old gods alongside continued worship of the Aten. But while these negotiations were playing out in the royal palace, events beyond Amarna's borders were rapidly spinning out of control. Egypt's enemies had been watching the internal power struggles with growing excitement, and they sensed that the empire's moment of maximum weakness had finally arrived. The Hittites, Egypt's greatest rivals for control of the ancient Middle East, began moving troops toward Egyptian territories in Syria. The Nubians, who had been providing Egypt with gold for centuries, started questioning whether they really needed to keep paying tribute to a kingdom that seemed to be tearing itself apart. Even smaller powers that had never dared challenge Egyptian authority began testing the empire's responses to various provocations. This external pressure created exactly the kind of crisis that Nefertiti's enemies had been waiting for. Horemheb in particular seized on Egypt's military difficulties to argue that the kingdom needed strong traditional leadership to survive. He began circulating among the army's commanders, painting Nefertiti as a foreign influence who had weakened Egypt by prioritizing religious experimentation over imperial defense. The general's arguments were compelling because they contained enough truth to be dangerous. Egypt really had lost territory during the Amarna period. The empire's military really had been neglected while the royal family focused on building their new capital and promoting their new religion. And Nefertiti really was the most visible symbol of everything that had changed during those turbulent years. But Horemheb made one crucial miscalculation in his campaign against Nefertiti. He assumed that she would respond to pressure the way most politicians do, by becoming defensive, by trying to explain away her failures, by gradually retreating from her positions. Instead, Nefertiti did something that caught everyone off guard. She went on the offensive. Picture this moment, because it's one of the most audacious political moves in ancient history. Rather than waiting for her enemies to move against her, Nefertiti announced that she was personally leading a military campaign to restore Egyptian authority in the north. She would take command of the army, march into Syria, and prove once and for all that the new order she represented was strong enough to defend Egypt's interests. The reaction to this announcement was immediate and explosive. Traditional Egyptian society simply had no framework for understanding a female pharaoh who wanted to lead troops into battle. Queens were supposed to stay in the palace managing domestic affairs and providing heirs. Even the most powerful women in Egyptian history like Hatshepsut had ruled through surrogates and advisors rather than taking direct command of military operations. But Nefertiti wasn't asking for permission or trying to conform to traditional expectations. She was essentially betting her entire political future on her ability to succeed where Egypt's male rulers had recently failed. if she could restore Egyptian control over the disputed territories, if she could bring back tribute and prisoners and proof of victory, then no one would be able to question her legitimacy as pharaoh. The preparations for this campaign reveal just how thoroughly Nefertiti had thought through the political implications of her gamble. She didn't just gather troops and supplies. She carefully selected which commanders would accompany her and which would remain behind in Egypt. She made sure that her most trusted supporters were positioned to maintain control of key government functions while she was away, and she arranged for Tutankhamun to remain in Amarna under the supervision of advisors she had personally chosen. But the most revealing aspect of Nefertiti's military preparations was how she presented the campaign to the Egyptian people. Rather than framing it as a desperate attempt to shore up her failing regime, she portrayed it as the natural culmination of the religious revolution that she and Akhenaten had begun. The Aten, she proclaimed, was not just the god of Egypt, but the god of all nations. By extending Egyptian control over foreign territories, she was actually spreading the true faith to peoples who had been living in ignorance of the sun disk's universal authority. This wasn't just imperial conquest. It was a holy war fought on behalf of the one true deity. This religious framing of her military campaign was politically brilliant because it transformed Nefertiti's greatest weakness into a potential source of strength. Critics had always argued that the Aten worship was a foreign innovation that had no place in Egyptian religion. Now, Nefertiti was essentially arguing that Egypt's imperial mission was to bring this superior religious understanding to the rest of the world. The army that marched north from Egypt in what was probably year 19 of the Amarna period was unlike any force that had ever taken the field under pharaonic command. At its head rode a woman wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, followed by carefully selected commanders who had sworn personal loyalty to her rather than to the traditional military hierarchy. The troops themselves were a mixture of Egyptian regulars and foreign mercenaries bound together not by shared ethnicity or traditional loyalty to the pharaonic institution, but by their commitment to the revolutionary ideals that Nefertiti represented. These were men who had been marginalized under the old system, soldiers who saw in Nefertiti's rise to power proof that merit and loyalty could triumph over birth and tradition. But as this unprecedented army made its way toward the contested territories of Syria, events back in Egypt were moving in directions that would ultimately prove far more decisive than anything that happened on the battlefield. Nefertiti's own father was having a series of very private conversations with some very important people. The old man had watched his daughter's increasingly desperate political maneuvers with growing alarm, and he had reached a conclusion that would have devastating consequences for the woman who had made his rise to power possible. Nefertiti had become too dangerous, not just to Egypt's traditional order, but to her own supporters. Her military campaign was either going to succeed spectacularly, making her politically untouchable, or fail catastrophically, bringing down everyone associated with her regime. Either outcome posed serious risks for a man like who had built his career on being indispensable to whoever happened to be in power. So I began reaching out to other power brokers who shared his concerns about Nefertiti's increasingly erratic behavior. He spoke carefully with representatives of the old priesthood, suggesting that perhaps the time had come for a more moderate approach to religious reform. He had quiet conversations with military commanders who had remained in Egypt, exploring their thoughts about the kingdom's future leadership needs. Most importantly, he began spending more time with the young Tutankhamun, gradually convincing the boy that his stepmother's ambitions were putting the entire royal family at risk. He painted a picture of a woman who had lost touch with political reality, who was gambling Egypt's future on increasingly desperate schemes to maintain her illegitimate hold on power. The old advisor was particularly skillful at exploiting Tutankhamun's adolescent insecurities. Here was a teenager who had grown up in the shadow of one of history's most powerful women, who had never been allowed to exercise real authority despite his royal bloodline. I whispered that Nefertiti saw the boy as nothing more than a useful figurehead, someone to be manipulated and controlled rather than respected as a legitimate heir to the pharaonic tradition. These conversations were having exactly the effect that I intended. By the time reports began filtering back from Nefertiti's military campaign, Tutankhamun had been thoroughly convinced that his stepmother represented a threat to everything he should rightfully inherit. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine not just who ruled Egypt, but what kind of civilization the kingdom would become. And then, just when the political situation seemed like it couldn't become any more complicated, something happened that changed everything. A messenger arrived in Amarna with news from the north that would either vindicate Nefertiti's desperate gamble or provide her enemies with the perfect excuse to move against her once and for all. The reports from Syria were mixed, which in the deadly game of palace politics was almost worse than outright failure. Nefertiti's forces had won some battles and lost others. They had managed to restore Egyptian control over several important cities, but they had also suffered significant casualties and failed to achieve the kind of overwhelming victory that would silence all criticism of her leadership. More troubling still were the reports about Nefertiti's behavior during the campaign. According to soldiers who had returned to Egypt, the female pharaoh had personally participated in several battles, fighting alongside her troops in a manner that scandalized even her supporters. There were stories about her interrogating prisoners, making strategic decisions without consulting her commanders, and conducting religious ceremonies that seemed to blend traditional Egyptian practices with completely new rituals. These reports created a perfect opportunity for Nefertiti's enemies to move against her. Horemheb and their allies began circulating stories about a queen who had been driven mad by power, who was endangering Egypt's military by treating warfare like some kind of religious ritual. They painted her campaign not as a heroic attempt to restore Egyptian authority, but as the reckless adventure of a woman who had completely lost touch with reality. Tutankhamun, now fully convinced that his stepmother posed a threat to his rightful inheritance, agreed to put his name to a proclamation that would effectively end Nefertiti's reign. The document, carefully crafted by I and his allies, announced that the young king was taking personal control of Egypt's government to protect the kingdom from the dangerous innovations that had weakened it during the Amarna period. The proclamation was a masterpiece of political propaganda. It didn't directly attack Nefertiti or accuse her of any specific crimes. Instead, it presented Tutankhamun's power grab as a reluctant response to circumstances beyond anyone's control. The young king was simply doing his duty to Egypt and to the gods by restoring traditional order to a kingdom that had been led astray by well-intentioned but ultimately misguided reforms. But the most devastating aspect of the proclamation was how it reframed Nefertiti's entire career. Rather than acknowledging her as a legitimate pharaoh who had ruled Egypt in her own right, it described her as a regent who had served admirably during Tutankhamun's minority, but who had unfortunately overstepped her proper authority. She wasn't being overthrown. She was simply being asked to step aside now that the rightful king was old enough to rule. This careful language was designed to give Nefertiti a face, saving way to accept her political defeat. If she agreed to return to Egypt and resume the more traditional role of queen mother, she could maintain her dignity and probably her life. All she had to do was abandon her claims to pharaonic authority and accept that her unprecedented experiment in female rule had come to an end. The proclamation was dispatched to Syria with great ceremony, carried by messengers who had been carefully instructed to present it as an opportunity for reconciliation rather than an ultimatum. But everyone involved in its creation understood exactly what they were really offering Nefertiti: surrender now or face the consequences of continued resistance. What happened next would determine whether the woman who had called herself Pharaoh would accept political defeat gracefully or choose to fight to the bitter end. The answer would reveal not just Nefertiti's character, but the true nature of the revolution she had tried to lead. And that answer, when it came, would be so shocking that it would echo through Egyptian history for the next 3,000 years. The messenger who carried Tutankhamun's proclamation to Syria must have expected to find a defeated woman ready to accept the inevitable. After all, what could one isolated female pharaoh do against the combined forces of Egypt's traditional power structure? But when he finally located Nefertiti's camp near the ancient city of Damascus, he discovered something that would have sent chills down the spine of anyone who understood Egyptian politics. Nefertiti wasn't just still fighting, she was winning. The reports that had filtered back to Egypt had been deliberately distorted by her enemies to make her campaign seem like a desperate failure. In reality, Nefertiti had achieved something that no Egyptian ruler had managed in decades. She had not only restored Egyptian control over the disputed Syrian territories, she had pushed further north than any pharaoh since the great conqueror Thutmose III. More importantly, she had done it in a way that created genuine loyalty among the conquered populations. Instead of simply demanding tribute and submission, Nefertiti had established a new model of Egyptian rule that combined military strength with religious tolerance. Local gods were incorporated into Aten worship, local customs were respected, and local leaders were given real authority within the Egyptian administrative system. This wasn't just military conquest, it was political genius. Nefertiti had created a buffer zone of genuinely loyal subjects who would defend Egyptian interests, not because they were forced to, but because Egyptian rule had actually improved their lives. For the first time in generations, Egypt's northern borders were truly secure. But the messenger carrying Tutankhamun's proclamation didn't see the strategic brilliance of what Nefertiti had accomplished. All he saw was a woman who had violated every traditional expectation of how Egyptian queens should behave. She wore armor instead of ceremonial robes. She consulted directly with foreign officials instead of working through Egyptian intermediaries. And most shocking of all, she had established her own court in Syria instead of maintaining proper deference to the royal center back in Egypt. When the messenger finally gained an audience with Nefertiti, he found himself face to face with someone who seemed to have been transformed by her military success. Gone was any trace of the desperate politician who had left Egypt months earlier. In her place stood a woman who radiated the kind of absolute confidence that comes from proving your enemies wrong in the most spectacular way possible. The messenger began reading Tutankhamun's proclamation, probably expecting Nefertiti to interrupt him with protests or pleas for negotiation. Instead, she listened in complete silence until he had finished every word. Then she asked a single question that revealed just how thoroughly she understood the political game being played against her. "Tell me," she said, "who wrote these words? Because they certainly didn't come from the mind of a child." The messenger, caught off guard by her directness, stammered something about the young king receiving guidance from his advisors. Nefertiti's response was a laugh that contained no humor whatsoever. "Guidance," she repeated. "Is that what they're calling treason these days? What happened next became the stuff of legend among the soldiers who witnessed it. Instead of sending back a formal written response to Tutankhamun's proclamation, Nefertiti dictated a message that was so audacious it took the messenger's breath away. She wasn't returning to Egypt as a defeated queen seeking mercy. She was staying in Syria as pharaoh, ruling over territories that she had personally conquered in the name of the Aden. Anyone who wished to challenge her authority was welcome to come north and try to take these lands away from her by force. Until then, she would govern her new kingdom according to her own vision of what Egyptian civilization could become. The messenger must have thought he was listening to the ravings of a mad woman. No Egyptian ruler had ever voluntarily divided the kingdom. The very concept of competing pharaohs was so alien to Egyptian political thought that there wasn't even proper vocabulary to describe what Nefertiti was proposing. But Nefertiti wasn't finished. She had one more message for the people back in Egypt who thought they could manipulate her stepson into betraying her. She was pregnant. Let that sink in for a moment. Here's a woman who had just established herself as an independent ruler over Egyptian Syria and territories. And now she's announcing that she's carrying what could be the next pharaoh. If the child was a boy, he would have a legitimate claim to rule all of Egypt based on his mother's proven ability to defend Egyptian interests and expand Egyptian territory. The political implications of this announcement were staggering. Tutankhamun was still just a teenager with no military experience and no proven ability to govern. Nefertiti was a mature ruler who had just demonstrated her capability by achieving military victories that had eluded Egypt's leaders for decades. Any child she bore would represent a continuation of her successful policies, while Tutankhamun represented nothing more than a return to the failed approaches of the past. The messenger rode back to Egypt, carrying news that would throw the entire kingdom into chaos. The woman they had tried to politically outmaneuver had instead outmaneuvered them, transforming what should have been her moment of greatest weakness into a position of unprecedented strength. When word of Nefertiti's response reached Amarna, the reaction was immediate and explosive. I, who had orchestrated the entire plot to remove his daughter from power, found himself facing a situation he had never anticipated. Instead of eliminating Nefertiti as a political threat, he had inadvertently created something far more dangerous. A rival pharaoh with her own territory, her own army, and her own vision for Egypt's future. Horemheb's reaction was even more intense. The general had spent months arguing that Egypt needed strong military leadership to restore its position in the ancient world. Now he was confronted with the humiliating reality that a woman had achieved military successes that had eluded him and his fellow commanders for years. But it was Tutankhamun's response that revealed just how thoroughly Nefertiti had outplayed her enemies. The teenage pharaoh, who had been so confident when he signed the proclamation demanding his stepmother's submission, now found himself in an impossible position. If he accepted Nefertiti's independence, he would be acknowledging that Egypt could be legitimately divided between competing rulers. If he tried to force her to return, he would be starting a civil war against someone who had just proven her military capabilities. The young king's advisors urged him to take immediate military action. Egypt couldn't tolerate the existence of a rival pharaoh, they argued, especially not one who might produce an heir with a stronger claim to legitimacy than Tutankhamun himself possessed. Every day that Nefertiti remained independent in Syria was another day that undermined the entire basis of pharaonic authority. But Tutankhamun hesitated, and that hesitation revealed something crucial about the political situation. Despite all the propaganda about restoring traditional Egyptian values, despite all the criticism of Nefertiti's unconventional methods, The simple truth was that she had succeeded where traditional approaches had failed. Her Syrian territories were more secure, more prosperous, and more loyal to thank you.